So, welcome to another episode of the IMF podcast. This is actually our inaugural video podcast. We have not abandoned the audio podcast, but we'll be doing more of these to sort of, in the spirit of keeping up with the times and the evolution of the various podcast platforms. Today, we'll be talking about alarmingly high debt and how fiscal policy might help bridge the gap between what's technically possible and politically feasible. And we have the two heads of the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department, Rodrigo Valdés and his deputy, Dabla-Norris. You can read their article on the topic in the March issue of the IMF's Finance and Development magazine. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
All right. So we hear the word unprecedented in a lot of research these days, and your recent work on debt and fiscal policy is no exception. Maybe, Era, we can start with you. Paint us a picture of just how much of a burden debt has become.
Okay, so Bruce, let me start with the global picture. In 2025, global debt to GDP was 93% of GDP.
Right.
If we fast forward and say, what would it look like over the next, say, 7 years, we're projecting 100% of GDP,
Wow.
not more. Now, these types of levels of debt are only those that we've seen during wars. So in peacetime, we haven't seen these kind of levels of debt in the past. Now, it's unprecedented because what typically tends to happen after wars, and if you think about COVID as a war where countries sort of ramped up spending, rightfully so, there was a pandemic that needed to be addressed and the economic ill effects cushioned. Typically, if you think about COVID as war, after a war, countries brought down debt. Whereas where we look at the picture now, globally and for some of the large systemically important economies, what we're seeing is that the trajectory of debt is not bending down.
Wow.
And that, in a sense, is unprecedented. So even for those countries where debt has stabilized, debt levels for emerging market developing economies are much higher than they were prior to the pandemic.
So Rodrigo, maybe how did we go from relatively moderate debt levels to sort of what Era is describing there as essentially unsustainable debt levels in such a short period of time?
I think that there are a couple of reasons for that. One was bad luck in terms of shocks. We had the global crisis, financial crisis, and then COVID. And those two episodes produce a step increase in debt for good reasons. But at the same time, I think the second part is that we got used to very low interest rates, and therefore having debt was not a problem. And what we see as reality today is that the last 10 years of interest rates as very low is something that won't repeat itself. Interest rates today are much higher. Therefore, the toll that you have to pay for carrying this debt is much bigger. Yeah. And that's super problematic and explains part of this. Adding to this issue of interest rates, let me also mention that for different reasons, we are unable to do the correct things when the situation is normal. It's not strange, but it's good that we can increase debt when needed. Yeah. The problem is that we are not doing the homework in normal times, in good times. And that's more new, I would say, because in the past, when we had good cycles, we used to see that countries will lower their debt ratios. Right now, in many countries, not everywhere, but in many countries, debt continues to go up and up, no matter what.
And maybe if I could just come in there, I mean, one of the things that we found in our research in the Fiscal Affairs Department was that there's sort of a long-standing pattern of political platforms supporting higher spending. So in contrast to the 1980s, where you sort of had this rhetoric of more restraint discourse in fiscal policy making, we see this expansionary discourse taking root. And this is true not just in advanced economies, this was true in emerging market economies as well. So underpinning this rise in debt, there are shocks, but there's also a long-standing pattern of governments sort of giving away goodies and the public expecting or demanding support. And this is a long-standing structural pattern that we observe in the data as well.
To put it more in a political sense, typically the leftist parties would like more spending, and society or the opposition will say, wait, let's see what debt is going, don't go too fast.
Yeah.
Or right-wing parties will say, let's cut taxes. And the opposition will say, wait, let's see. There's a sort of implicit pact right now that each part of society is pushing their agenda without too much opposition of the rest. Nobody cares too much about that. So we cut taxes and increase spending as if it were possible forever. And unfortunately, it is not.
And it's interesting because in our research, we actually found that to be the case, that when we looked across the political spectrum, I mean, people are converging. So the two sides are actually converging. And you can see this in the way they speak in their manifestos.
So, I mean, what does it mean? Like, what does all this debt mean for those governments that are actually trying to keep their electorates happy?
At the end of the day, this is a very complex problem because people are not suffering the consequences immediately. There are many potential really bad consequences, but we're not seeing this immediately. This is a gradual sort of build-up process until you hit the wall. There are, however, a few things in the short run that are happening underneath that are not very visible but matter. Interest rates are higher because of higher debt. That means that if you want to buy a house, you're paying a higher mortgage because of the fiscal side. Yeah. There are taxes that you need to put there, that distortion, that produce problems for the workings of the economy. So that's another negative. So it's not free what we're seeing. But unfortunately, what we see is that it's very difficult to get together and say, okay, look, this will be problematic in a few years. Let's act now. And that's the optimal part.
And then maybe just to add to what Rodrigo was saying. I mean, already when debt levels are really high, there's a lot of pressure for monetary policy to accommodate. And so there's risk of fiscal dominance is something that worries us. And the higher the level of debt, the more the incentive, if you will, to have some form of financial repression. We've seen this, and in history teaches us this lesson. So this is nothing new. And there's more pressure on central banks to accommodate fiscal largesse. So this is, from a macro perspective, this is really a threat. But for a lot of low-income and emerging market economies, there's another component to it. So take low-income countries. On average, 21% or over 20% of revenues goes into paying interest. I mean, so if you think about what share of your revenues are your interest payments, about over 20% on average. That means this money that could then have been used for education, for healthcare, for creating opportunities for your people is no longer there. So there are these really explicit trade-offs that high debt levels generate.
Look, the point Mary is mentioning is super important. Imagine a family that earns 100 every month and devotes 21 just to pay interest, not to pay the principal part of debt. So the debt at the end of the month is the same as at the beginning of the month, but you devoted 21 of the 100 just to pay the interest. That's really bad. Everybody has someone in the family that enter into troubles. Yeah. Well, this is a typical example. This applies to countries. The same as the uncle or the aunt that had these problems with the credit cards, this applies here too.
So at the end of the day, governments are going to be having to make these really difficult decisions for which taxpayers are going to feel the pinch. And there is research out there and some of your own research, Era, about how there's an erosion of faith in governments to actually fix anything. So how do these governments tighten the belt without it becoming an existential threat for them?
So maybe I'll come in a little bit with my research, but then I'm going to turn to Rodrigo, since he was a former minister and he knows really the challenges that politicians and governments face. So my research points to something that we're all talking about, which is that there seems to be, or there appears to be, a trust deficit in societies. There are many polls that point to this, and my research or our research with Francesco Bianchi and Salma Khalid points to the fact that part of this trust deficit could be coming from the fact that people just don't understand how fiscal policy works. So in our survey of 27,000 nationally representative individuals from 13 countries, we found that only 40% understood that lower taxes or higher spending leads to higher deficits. Less than 60% could accurately identify the level of debt in their country, let alone in high debt countries. So the situation was even worse in high debt countries. And so there is this sense that if you don't understand what fiscal policy is about or what this debt can imply, then why should we have reforms? Or why is fiscal consolidation of any sort necessary? Why should we tighten our belt when we don't even understand the situation? So that's one part of the story. Yeah. A second really important part of the story is that we found that it makes you, if you don't understand or if you don't trust the government, it makes you more pessimistic about the efficacy of policies. So in our survey, we found that people who trusted their government or who reported trusting their government were 20% more likely to believe that their policy actions were actually going to help reduce or stabilize debt. They were also more optimistic about how they were going to fare, so their welfare as a result of these policies. So in essence, not understanding what economic situation is or what fiscal policy can do and what high level of debt can do can breed this mistrust. And then lack of trust in itself can also mean that you don't trust that the government will actually do the things that is required to correct the situation.
Let me give you one line that I think is very telling, has been used by some politicians. Now that they say, look, we know what we should do. The problem is that we don't know how to win the next election after we do what we have to do. And that goes to your point, no, that this is not very popular at the end. So the way out at the end of the day, and this is our piece really in F&D, is that you have to build a broad coalition of trust to go ahead. And that trust is not mechanical, it's not that there's a recipe, but you need to have, first, you need to explain.
People need to understand fundamentally.
Exactly. They have to be a simple explanation of why you need to do this. Second thing that is critical, people need to find that this is a fair arrangement. If you really believe that the cost will be bear by you and not the rest, that's a no-no. So how to produce a package that is equilibrated is pure politics at the end, but it's central to the fiscal policy to work. No, and in our piece we mention a few things that help this. Transparency, for example, is important. So that's why at the fund we push a lot about transparency on fiscal. There are many other, I would say, small institutional things that you can do at the fiscal level that at the end help to build this trust that people need to see to jump with you through the process of solving this. You will need to probably cut a bit of your spending side, probably you have to increase a bit of your taxes. We have seen this repeatedly in pension reforms, for example. The discussion about increasing the age of retirement is super complex, but it's doable at the same time. You need to go through the process of convincing, of showing what are the benefits, showing that it's again, a fair arrangement.
Yeah. And actually, the Fiscal Monitor from last year, we actually had a chapter, the analytical chapter was on sentiment around two very contentious reforms, pension reforms that Rodrigo mentioned, and energy subsidy reforms. And then we found that it is possible to get buy-in depending upon how you sequence it, what were the compensatory policies around this, how do you educate the public, how do you get buy-in. And it is possible to get these kind of reforms. And I mean, the period during World War II and before the war and after the war, when countries ramped up huge levels of debt, and then this debt had to be paid, in those societies where they managed to do this, there was buy-in. There was sort of a collective buy-in. We were fighting a common cause. And there's a purpose behind this level of debt, and this is why we need to do this. So I think there's getting this kind of a common understanding and buy-in, because people have an intrinsic fear that they are the ones who are going to be penalized. In fact, my research shows that very, very clearly. So if you ask people who are wealthy, who do you think that you believe there will be an adjustment? Who do you think, on whom do you think taxes will be raised? They point to the wealthy and corporations. Yeah. And if you ask lower middle or middle income individuals from the survey, who do you believe, whose spending will be cut? They believe pensions will be cut, or those types of benefits that they receive will be cut. So there is a sense of loss aversion. People believe they will be hit by any fiscal action or any adjustment, which is why building these kind of coalitions, as Rodrigo was saying, and really trying to get buy-in or support for these reforms becomes so important.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a sense of this instant satisfaction that people are looking for, and the benefits from these policies usually take a little bit of time before people can realize them. And you talk about, in your article, you also talk about the multi-generational impact of this debt burden, and how it's not only today's problem, that tomorrow's workers will continue to pay for this. So where does the responsibility lie in terms of managing this debt from one administration to the other?
So maybe I'm going to just sort of be a little philosophical and step back a little and say, fiscal policy is inherently always about this question of who will pay. Because every time you rack up debt, you have to pay for it. I mean, you need to generate enough surpluses in the future that can be taxed in order to repay the debt. And so there's fundamentally an intergenerational component. It's either today's taxpayers or future taxpayers. And any other solution that you can think about to bring down debt requires this kind of a trade-off. Somebody has got to pay. Either it's creditors or debtors. I mean, so there's always a trade-off there. And the intergenerational one is a particularly tricky one for a lot of advanced and emerging market economies at this juncture. Why? Populations are aging, which means that expenditures on health and spending on health and pensions are going to increase in the coming years, dramatically increase in the coming years. At the same time, we're going to have fewer workers. So the burden is going to be borne by fewer and fewer people. Already, when you look at the number of workers per retirees, it's declined dramatically from the last 20, 25 years. So we see this change, and I think that's the intergenerational component we highlight in the paper. That someone has to pay the bill, and if it's going to be the future young, at the expense of current consumption today, then implicitly we're penalizing them, because these are not choices that they necessarily would have made.
Yeah, I mean, we are entering in a phase in the world where many countries are peaking their levels of population. And if we continue having few babies, we're having one per woman on average. That means that this will continue. And that means that the same debt has to be, at the end, managed by fewer and fewer and fewer people. That's very complex. Now, politically speaking, it's very interesting to see that many people are very worried about environmental implications for the future, which is great. Those same do not care too much about debt. And those who care about debt care not too much about environmental issues. We have to try to convince that deeply they are the same problem, that we need to have some intergenerational equity here, which is, I mean, a basic for society, no?
And for in the article, we emphasize this, that, I mean, essentially resolving this debt problem, conundrum, the high debt conundrum, is an issue of fairness. It is an issue of fairness across different groups and societies across time.
Right, and so going back to this trust, in the article you say that in fact, yes, fiscal policy is about distributing the costs across time, as you just said, and across different social groups, and that trust is the currency that makes that distribution politically feasible. But as you also alluded to, or even, I mean, as you said earlier, that trust is really at an all-time low. Um, so how do you fix that, and what are the consequences if that trust is never regained by governments?
Look, let me say that it's difficult but not impossible first, because we see some cases around the world where there is an agreement that you need to do an adjustment. In my own country, in Chile, for example, these days,
Yeah.
there's a big scandal because of fiscal numbers, and that's very good because societies learn that this is important. The second thing that I want to mention here is that it's very critical that some main political parties agree that this is important, even if they are not from the same coalition.
Right.
If you have an equilibrium whereby basically those in power want to do something, but the opposition doesn't want to pay any cost, and moreover, they want to use the opportunity to point, etc., that's much more difficult. So this starts, I think, from the main parties talking to each other and saying, look, there are some topics which we really have to put to the side. That if we really do the political discussion in the short run with this will not end well. Countries have done this. In the past, for example, in Spain, there's a very interesting case for pensions, that they decided, you know what, we cannot run presidential platforms on pensions because then pensions are so long run, so complex, and they agree, let's put it on the side.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but Uruguay is another very good example of a contentious pension reform that was that they were able to carry out. I mean, Morocco is another example of energy subsidy reform. So there's lots of examples of reforms that were carried out across different countries. I mean, I think it's important to understand that fundamentally there is a present bias in policy making, right? I mean, what happens 5 or 10 years down the line, it's hard for policymakers and also individuals to worry about, right? There's a present bias in the way we think about our lives as well. So it's not surprising. But the ingredients that Rodrigo and I have talked about in the article as well, which are communicating, making sure that people understand, being clear, explicit about the trade-offs and what the cost of inaction could be. So educating people on this, and for the political parties to have dialogue and discussion on what the costs are for them, and thinking about this not just in terms of a present issue, but from an intergenerational perspective, can be really important in highlighting what the trade-offs are.
In the article, we mentioned a few sort of institutional arrangements that help. I mentioned transparency recently, but there are things, for example, fiscal councils. It's a new technology, quote unquote, that is being used in many places where it's really a watchdog across parties who is a bit of a problem for the Minister of Finance because this watchdog will be pointing to things, but that helps to produce the consensus that you need. The same happens, for example, with managing well fiscal money. It's very, very important to avoid this feeling that many people have that this is waste. If it's waste, why I would really care?
Exactly. And if it's waste, then why should I pay taxes? And you see this in a lot of developing emerging market economies. Tax to GDP ratios are really low, and it's really hard to mobilize revenues because you have massive corruption scandals and that sort of force people to think, well, why would I pay my taxes if they're just going to be wasted in the first place? So I think that is really important.
So how to manage the wage bill, how much money you pay to your people in the government is critical. What do you do with public enterprises? Sometimes there is waste there. You can arrange ways to really make a review of one sector. Are we doing this correctly, or we could do more with less money? That is critical to build this trust.
So, the skeptics would say that building trust doesn't pay the bills. But what you're saying here is, maybe it does, right?
Well, maybe it forces people to also understand that they can't, citizens to understand that they can't have it all.
Right.
But they all can also understand, just using the example that Rodrigo gave, like in a family, there's budgets and there's constraints. And something has got to give. And then the question is what? That's decided by the social compact, or the contract that exists in different societies. But that kind of a discussion and dialogue has to happen. And so the point is that if citizens and governments understand that there's trade-offs and there's costs, because so often we don't even have that debate about costs, then it's easier to at least converge on what are the parameters we should be discussing and where we can give.
Complicated. There's all kinds of things happening in the current fiscal space. Thanks so much to the both of you for trying to make sense of it all. Rodrigo Valdés is the director, and Ira Dabla-Norris is the deputy in the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce.
For having us.